Hello there. I'm Reverend Nhien, founder of Evolving Enneagram. If you've been seeking a compassion-based, contemplative approach to Enneagram-informed transformation, you are most certainly in the right place. This is where contemplation meets the Enneagram. We are in week 51 of a 52-week Sunday Talk series based on the book by Oren Sofer, Your Heart Was Made for This. Today's theme is forgiveness, and we started this theme last week. So if you haven't already listened to last week's talk, I highly encourage it. It was focused on forgiveness of others, but also includes an important forgiveness practice or prayer that you can engage in to support your own journey of even being willing to forgive in the first place. And then today's talk is entitled Self-Forgiveness by Enneagram Type. And I will take today in two parts. In part one, I will share some of my personal journey and reflections on self-forgiveness. And then in part two, I will share straight out of my upcoming book, The Enneagram of the Soul, because the topic of forgiveness is so dear to me. I write about it in the book, and I will share invitations basically by Enneagram type, things to look at as you journey in this path of, I hope, forgiving yourself. So, with that, let's begin. So, I'd like to begin by sharing some of my personal journey as well as reflections on self-forgiveness. My own self-forgiveness journey began about 20 years ago when I hit a bottom in my life, and like a massive bottom in my life, and found myself in a 12-step program of recovery. At the time, I felt completely lost and broken. And uh, the 12-step program was offered a huge guide for sort of like finding my way back to a sense of like who I am and my place in the world. And one of the things that helped me to do that was actually working the 12 steps, and in particular, step four. Some of you listening are very familiar with the 12 steps, but I'm not going to make that assumption. So the fourth step involves this inventory where you make a list of like all your fears and also all your resentments. And my list was like a packet, like a book. It took a while to do. And when I did the list of resentments, that's what I'll focus on today. I realized it was like not until then that I actually realized that I was resentful toward like the top two things were God. Again, not a personified God, but like the universe. I was angry at God. And the second thing on my list was me. And I realized that at the time, so here I was at this place where like my life felt shattered, and I didn't know anything about like applying self-compassion, which is what I primarily teach now. But at that time, I didn't have that kind of guidance or tool. And so the first thing I did was lash out at myself. So not only was I upset at like where I had arrived, but I was like, all those wasted years, Nyan, right? When you were unconscious. So the first thing I did was look back to my past and then judge myself for all of the things I quote did wrong. And what did that do? That just started spiraling me, right? So recognizing that and being able to put it down and being willing to begin to even forgive myself, to let those things go, to let the resentments go, not just toward other people, but toward myself was the beginning of like this real freedom. But yeah, back then I wanted to go back. I wanted to change my past. I wanted to make different choices. And the kinds of things I needed to forgive myself for were things like, embarrassingly, like allowing other people's opinions of me matter more than being true to myself, right? Again, I didn't know that like, that's all I knew or understood. Somehow now I understand that the type 3 lens really impacts that like somehow we believe that if we get approval, then we will be worthy. Not we can assume our worth and do what our truth calls us to be and to do. Like that's a foreign idea learned only through spiritual practice and the Enneagram. And the other things I needed to forgive myself for were, I blamed life a lot growing up. I blamed my parents. And when I realized through personal growth work that, oh my God, so much of it was me, my choices, my attitudes, my limiting beliefs, then I had to really begin to look at each time I erroneously hurt or judged others, especially like my family members, and be willing to like move through that, be willing to heal through that, be willing to essentially forgive myself. So those are just some examples from my life. And I encourage you to take a moment to consider this, that even if you're not in a 12-step program of recovery, or even if you are, and it's been a while since you've done this 4-step inventory, it can be so powerful because there is something about naming, listing, like seeing it clearly on the page in uh, the ways that we like bar love uh, by staying guilty, if you will. Speaking of the word guilt, one thing I want to share that I feel is important to the journey that I see, not just in my own personal journey, but with the people whom I spiritually companion, is that the distinction that I learned actually through 12-step between guilt and shame is very, very important. What I find is the definition I've been given is that guilt is feeling badly for something you did, and shame is feeling badly for who you are, right? So shame cuts us to the core. And what I found that was actually impeding my journey was that when I recognized that I had behaved unskillfully, that I had unconsciously, or sometimes consciously, hurt other people, but done it from this deeply unconscious place within myself, that the shame spiral would be so great that I would despair. And when we despair, we don't improve. We become despondent, right? Because despair is hopeless. But the reason I despaired is because my limiting belief system is like, oh, if I did something wrong, I am fundamentally wrong. So what could have just been a healthy guilt that could lead me to shifting and changing action would spiral into shame. And so I want to just invite you to consider that, because it's like sometimes we feel like we're better. Like if we respond, if we've hurt someone else and we realize it, that I've seen this in people where that shame spiral, you feel like as if you're a good person because you feel badly now, and that makes you caring. And but yet that if it's like equated with the sense of I'm just fundamentally flawed, then there's no hopefulness in that. And so you actually render yourself powerless, impotent to make any other choice, right? If that's just who you are. And so consider that reorienting around this notion that you are actually fundamentally whole, fundamentally at the level of spirit, which is not to say that on the human level you do everything perfectly, right? But if we don't believe we're fundamentally beloved, then there isn't like a way out of that that allows us to uh, call upon something higher than ourselves. Henry Nouwen, in his book Life of the Beloved, wrote this: self-rejection is the greatest enemy of the spiritual life because it contradicts the sacred voice that calls us the beloved. And so it's important to also say explicitly that just because we feel or allow ourselves to believe and know that we are in truth, in spiritual truth, the beloved, that doesn't mean that we're, quote, off the hook in the sense of not taking responsibility to bring greater love into the world, and to take full responsibility for the ramifications of our actions. And Tara Brach has said this, I love this: feeling compassion for ourselves in no way releases us from responsibility for our actions. Rather, it releases us from the self-hatred that prevents us from responding to our life with clarity and balance. It's just important to say that when we don't forgive ourselves, we are really taking the prideful route that our worldly or material judgment is more valid than the spiritual truth of our belovedness and the belovedness of all of life, right? And we can trust that if we lean into that belovedness, that compassion, we don't actually move away from a sense of responsibility. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, we actually are more response able. We're able to respond, and we can respond more effectively from that ground of being. And, A Course in Miracles, this is one of my favorite quotes, so you'll probably hear me say it often, but A Course in Miracles teaches that it's not that we should not judge, it's that we cannot. We don't have all the information. And so we become, when we don't forgive ourselves, we're deciding that we are the judge and jury of all, right? We've decided that we know what's best and what's true, and sinking into the spiritual truth rather than the worldly truth that we are fundamentally beloved, creates a foundation from which that belovedness expresses more fully in the world. So with that, I want to move into part 2. So, forgiving yourself. I'll run through these and you can close your eyes if it's safe to do so, listening to the activations for each Enneagram type, starting with type 1. Type 1. Remember, no one gets everything right. No one does everything perfectly. Do not punish yourself for being human. Send more love and compassion to yourself when you discover that you've erred, not less. Be a place of peace for yourself, not an enabler of domestic inner violence. Type 2. It is not your job to make everyone happy. It is not reasonable to expect everyone to like you. Yet when important relationships aren't as strong or positive as you would like them to be, you take on more than your share of blame and responsibility. Do your best to let this go. Type 3. Until you forgive yourself, you'll spend the rest of your days and nights overcompensating for where you feel you have failed. As you drive yourself harder and harder, you can tend to end up further and further away from your true path. Forgive yourself so you can welcome the full worthiness of who you are today and not keep looking for it in the future. Type 4. What you most need to forgive in yourself isn't one thing or another that you did. Rather, it's who you are or think you are. You have condemned and shamed yourself from the beginning. Give yourself a new start. Forgive yourself for who you thought you should be or have been. Find your voice and power in fully embracing all the characteristics as well as the essence of who you are in this moment today. Type 5. You tend to harbor resentment toward anyone who has seemed to reject you. It is as if by rejecting them, you spare yourself the doubt and misgiving around how you were critiqued. If you make them smaller or more stupid by condemning them, then they have no authority to judge you. Notice what you have not yet forgiven in yourself. Likely it has to do with an area in which you feel fearful or incompetent. If someone else has triggered you, chances are that before you can forgive them, you need to release this high expectation of your own capabilities. For the 6, no amount of vigilance can possibly keep everyone you love, including you, safe. Yet when harm occurs, whether inadvertently, by your personal actions, or by an external cause you didn't foresee, you often judge yourself harshly. Letting the ghost of mistakes past haunt and torment you is inhumane. Moreover, it only fuels more anxiety and second guessing, which disempowers you from making wise and compassionate decisions in the present and for the future. Set yourself free from the shackles of the past. 7, if you are on a path of self-awareness, chances are you are realizing all the dreams you have sabotaged, the bridges you've burned, and the love that you have been too afraid to lean into. The fact that it is darkest before the dawn applies to your inner as well as the outer horizon. Your willingness to stay with the darkness, to feel your own fears, anger, resentment, or grief deep in your heart and bones, and not hastily move on, allows you to experience the dawning of a truly new and transformed life. For the 8, do not confuse moving on with letting go. Forgive yourself the big dreams that never fully materialized, the people you couldn't help, and the important situations you could not control. Your vision and appetite for bigness is a gift, but it is also a heavy burden. There is power you can claim in the present when you get real about what happened in the past. Bring compassionate strength to all that you have not yet grieved so you can finally let go. And the 9, when you finally wake up to parts of yourself that went to sleep, whether for weeks, months, or years, you can tend to be hard on yourself. Do not judge yourself for what you weren't ready to see or know or act on until now. Weep if you need to for your old self in life, but don't condemn yourself. This will only make you want to go back into hiding. Resist your tendency toward inertia. Coax yourself out further with self-forgiveness and loving kindness. In closing, forgiving ourselves is not about refusing to take responsibility for our actions. In fact, it's vital that we take whatever outer steps we can to make amends, to rectify past harms. But self-forgiveness, ultimately, it's this inner act. It's a vital part of our spiritual journey because it blocks us from divine love, the very thing we seek in the journey, that knowing of wholeness, that connection with spirit. And love cannot abide where it is not welcomed. Self-forgiveness is a gesture of opening and welcoming love once again. So here's to not locking up our souls in this self-made purgatory or exiling our hearts from divine grace and human belonging. The final thing I'll say is consider that when we forgive ourselves, it might well be possible that we break the karmic chain of causation from the past to the future and open up a space for grace to come in and for miracles to happen in our lives. Namaste.